Hi there and welcome to video number 2 in our Behind the Block series, where today we are going to be looking at the 9 patch. Hi, I'm Tom from How to Quilter and I want to help you love quilting as much as I do. I publish regular videos and tutorials that are going to help you if you're just starting out on your quilting journey or can help you improve the skills you may already have. Following on from our 4 patch, we're now going to be looking at a 9 patch, which is just as simple and just as easy to make. It's a great versatile block that can be used in many different quilt patterns, and it's a great block that can also be cut up and resewn back into other different quilt blocks. And at the end of this video, we'll take a look at some quilt patterns that you can make using this block. So let's get straight to seeing how to make the 9 patch. So to make this block, you're going to need fabric, a cutting mat, a rotary cutter, thread, pins or clips, an iron and something to iron on, a ruler, and a sewing machine. First of all, a couple of things we just want to quickly go over. There are 2 versions of this block. There is an A block, which consists of dark corners and dark middle, and then there is a B block, which consists of light corners and light middle. So in this video I'll be showing you the steps to make the basic block, and all you have to do is switch around the strips, but more on that later. Secondly, I'm using 2.5-inch strips that I've cut. Because I'm only making a couple of blocks for the demo, I haven't cut the full width of fabric, but you would cut the full width of fabric if you were making lots of these blocks. The 2.5-inch strips end up with a 6.5-inch unfinished block. That means all the pieces have been sewn together, but it's just a standalone block that hasn't been attached to anything else. And once it's sewn into the quilt pattern, it finishes at 6 inches square. So let's dive right into seeing how to make this really easy and simple 9-patch block. So we are going to be doing chain piecing and assembly line sewing to make these blocks, and this is the fastest way to make lots of these blocks. If you were only making one block, you would just follow these steps but use squares. So in this instance I would cut 2.5-inch squares and then sew them all together. But we're using strips, so let's talk about strips. So we're going to take a dark strip and a light strip and we're going to match the edges. And we do this by placing right sides together and then match those edges up nice and straight. It can be helpful to place the dark fabric on the bottom and the light fabric on the top, and that way when you're sewing you can see little bits of the dark fabric peeking through, and that means that your edges have just misaligned and you just need to adjust them as you're sewing. When you're making lots of these, you want to get all your groups together so that you can chain piece and assembly line piece. So if you are making say 10 lots of 2 strip, you want to match all the edges for all your strips at the same time so you can just sew them all through the sewing machine. I always like to sew with a leader first, and that just is a tiny little piece of scrap fabric that I put through before I do any of my block. And what that does is it stops that annoying little ball of thread that you get on the back and makes sure that the sewing machine tension is right. Much better to catch that now than sewing a big long strip of fabric and finding halfway through that it's not right. You don't need to cut threads or anything. All you need to do is take your strips and then just bump them up against the leader and then sew through for the length of your strip. You adjust your edges as necessary as you sew, making sure that the edges stay lined up. This is much easier if you put the dark fabric on the bottom because you will see it peeking through. When you get to the end of the strip, don't cut your thread, just get your next strip unit set, put it right up against the presser foot and sew it right on through. And keep doing that until you've sewn all your strip units that you need to sew together. All of this we're using a careful 1/4-inch seam. I have a seam guide on my sewing machine that's helping me with that, and I'm also using a 1/4-inch foot that I've measured and checked is the proper 1/4-inch. Once you're at your last strip, you're going to cut your threads on your sewing machine, and then with a pair of scissors cut all the connecting threads between the strip units, and then also cut the thread between the leader. Put it to one side because you'll need it again. Now we're going to gently open these seams using our fingers, and we're going to finger press them. Don't worry, we will properly press with the iron once we finish sewing, but for now we're just opening the seam up so that we can then sew the 3rd strip on. You want to keep the dark side on the top so that you can press the seam towards the dark side. Now to make an A block, take another dark strip, place it right sides together with the light side of the strip unit, and that makes part A. For the second part, the B block, all we need is a second light strip and we attach that to the side of the dark to give us the B block. So place them right sides together, light on top of the dark so you can see the edges peeking through, match the edges all the way down. Now repeat the same sewing here. Use your leader to start you off and then sew the strips together using a careful 1/4-inch. Once you've sewn the first strip set, get your next strip set, butt it straight up on the presser foot, sew it all the way through, and continue this until you've sewn all your strip units together, and then cut threads on the sewing machine. Take a pair of scissors again and cut the units apart, and then remove the leader and put it to one side for later. Now it's time to talk about pressing. Pressing can be a little bit tricky for long strips of fabric like this because they become distorted and wonky when we're not paying attention. So we're going to take this nice and slow, and there's a couple of things that we can do to help make this easier. So take your A block unit, so that's dark, light, dark, and you're going to place it so that one of the dark edges is facing up on the ironing board, and you're going to take your iron and you're going to gently set that seam along the length of the strip, and then you're going to open with your fingers and you're going to make sure the seam is fully open, and you're going to gently finger press along the entire seam. Then take your iron, and you can use the tip of the iron to help with this. Press that seam open, making sure to only move the iron along the length of the strip in a straight line. No diagonal ironing, straight line like this. That will help to keep the block nice and straight. Repeat that for the second side. Set the seam, open it, pressing the seam towards the dark side, finger press, and then press with the iron. And then once you're done, turn that over, and you want to make sure that both of the seams are going towards the dark strip. So what you should find is that the seams go away from the middle of the strip towards the outside. And then we repeat that for block B. We want to still press towards the dark side, so place dark side up and set the seam. Open that seam up, finger press it gently, making sure not to stretch or distort the block. Then take your iron and press along the seam, again sewing straight and up and down and not diagonally, because that will distort your block. Repeat the procedure for the other seam. Flip the unit over and check that both of the seams are pointing in the way towards the dark strip. In my case, you can see that a little bit of the seam hasn't quite folded over towards the dark side, but that's okay, don't worry. Just take your finger, press it flat, and then use the iron to fix it. Not a problem. Now, one thing that can be really helpful when pressing strip units is to have a ruler on your ironing surface. And once you've ironed, place that strip along the length of the ruler and check if it's straight. If it's not straight, it means that maybe one of the seams isn't fully opened and it just needs to be repressed, or you've maybe distorted it a bit and you need to do something to fix that. So adjust, iron, re-iron as necessary until you get a nice straight line along your ruler. Check the top and the bottom because it can distort on both sides. And once you're happy with that, let's take it to the cutting mat. At the cutting mat, what we're going to do is we're going to use one of the lines on the mat, and we're going to line the strip along that to give us a straight edge. We need to neaten up one of the edges, so taking your ruler and your rotary cutter at the edge of the strip, line it up. You might need to cut off half an inch, whatever you need to cut off to get rid of maybe salvages or a raggedy edge. Just line your ruler up wherever's appropriate. Use the lines on the mat and match them on the lines of your ruler. Once you're happy, check it again to make sure that it's okay, and then with the rotary cutter, cut that little bit off. Lift your ruler and get rid of that bit of scrap. We want to make sure that the edges are even before we start subcutting the strip into strip units. Now I'm cutting 2.5 inch strips, and I actually have a 2.5 inch wide ruler that makes this really easy. But you don't need a 2.5 inch ruler to do this. You can do this with just a standard ruler. As long as the ruler is longer than the height of the strip unit, you will be fine. Now I want to make sure that the strip unit is still nice and straight along the line of my cutting mat, and then I'm going to use the lines on this ruler to help make sure that I'm cutting straight. So on my ruler, I can make sure that the two middle seams are lining up with lines on the ruler, and I can make sure that lines at the top and the bottom of the strip are lining up on the ruler. I'm also making sure that the ruler is lining up with lines on the mat so that I know that everything is nice and square. When I'm happy with that, and really do take your time to make sure that it's all straight and it's all set right, because that makes a massive difference in your accurate cutting. And what you're going to do is you're just going to work your way along that strip, cutting whatever size of strips you need. So I need 2.5 inch strips, so I'm going to work my way along this, cutting 2.5 inch strips until I get to the end of the strip. All you need to do is cut your strip, lift your ruler, move the piece away, realign your ruler up on the strip, cut your next one, and keep going. Now I'm only cutting one strip at a time here to show you, but you can actually stack up 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 strips. If you're comfortable cutting that many, you can stagger them up, you can put them on your board, make sure everything lines up, and then you can cut multiple ones at a time. But I would suggest that if you are new to quilting, or you're not comfortable cutting more than one layer of fabric at a time, just stick with one strip, take your time, put a good song on, have a good old sing, measure cut, and just work your way through it until you're done. On my strip, my last bit isn't quite big enough to make a block, but I'm not going to get rid of that. I'm going to save it and keep it for something else. And just keep repeating this cutting procedure for all your strip units until you've cut them all up. A great tip that I've not shown you here though is that you can get some kind of box or container, so like a Chinese takeaway dish, a Tupperware dish, some kind of plastic dish. You need a couple of them, and what you can do is as you cut, you can put all the A's into one box, all the B's into another box. If you're doing this in multiple colours, you can separate them all up, and that will make it easy for you to stay nice and organised so that things don't get mixed up and messed up. So to make these two variations of the block, the A block, you will need 2 units that are dark, light, dark, and 1 unit that is light, dark, light. For the B block, you're going to need 2 units that are light, dark, light, and 1 unit that is dark, light, dark. You can lay these out on the table to make sure that you've got them all lined up, but if you're comfortable, you can just move straight ahead to the next step, which is matching and nesting seams. We take 2 strip units and place them right sides together. Make sure that you've got the right strip unit. So in this case, dark, light, dark, and a light, dark, light, right sides together. And what you can see is because of how we've pressed those seams, all the seams are going away from each other, which makes it super easy to nest them. When the seams nest and match, it gives you really accurate corners that are nice and crisp. So this is worth taking your time to get this right. When you're placing them together, you will feel little bumps that are moving about, and what you want to do is move them about until you feel the seams lock in place and they no longer move, and that means that you've successfully nested those seams. Do it one seam at a time, and once you've got it nested, take a pin and pin these from left to right side of the block. And the reason we do that is because that's much easier to remove when you're at the sewing machine. Because I have my seam guide on my right, if I was to put the pins from right to left, they would get stuck in the seam guide and potentially distort the block. So left to right, it makes it much easier to pull out. And don't forget, do not sew over those pins, because you can break a needle or you can damage your sewing machine. Now, you can pin as many of these sets together as you're making, because these are very easy to turn into A or B blocks simply by adding another dark, light, dark or a light, dark, light strip to either of these blocks, and that will give you A and B blocks. So match all your seams, nest them all, pin them, make a big pile, get them ready to sew your A pile and your B pile. Sew them through, starting with the leader, assembly line sew, passing them through one after the other, removing your pins before you get to the needle. Don't sew over your pins, and keep going until you've done all the ones that you need to do. Cut all your connecting threads and then open and marvel at those beautifully matched seams. To demonstrate why pinning is important, so here's a block unit that I matched, nested and then pinned before I sewed, and as you can see, those corners are matching very nicely. And in this one, I didn't pin it, I just nested it and then placed it on the sewing machine and sewed it without pins, and as you can see, it's ever so slightly off on the second corner. It's not a huge amount, and to be honest, probably nobody would notice that, but pinning is important because it can really help you to get beautifully accurate seams and corners. Now complete the block. Take those 2 strip units and then take the appropriate third unit, whether you're making an A or a B block, match and nest those seams and pin it. If you're not sure which block and which side to be adding it to, just place it down on the table, put the block in and check that it's in the right place, and then you can place it right sides together, match, nest and pin. Sew all these blocks together, repeating with a 1/4 inch seam, starting with a leader, chain piecing them all the way through until you've made all the blocks that you need to make, cut all the threads connecting the blocks, and then remove the leader, and sewing is done. Take a block, have a sneaky peek, check if the corners are matching. If they do, well done. If they're not quite right, chances are nobody will notice it unless it's really off. If it's really off, then you can get a seam ripper and you can unpick and you can do it again and match it. If it looks like something's really off, maybe also just check that that seam is fully open before you then re-sew it. And now finally, we've done all the work and we're ready to press these finished. We want to make sure that these will nest together as blocks. So on your A block, you want to press the seams away from the center of the block. So fold the block appropriately, set the seams, open up, making sure that the seam is going to go away from the center, and use your iron to press that seam open, and then repeat for the other side of the block. Turn it over and check and make sure that the seams are definitely going away from the center of the block. Press all your A blocks like that. For the B block, we want the opposite, so we So we press those seams going towards the center of the block. So repeat the procedure for pressing, set the seam, open it up and making sure it's going in the right direction, press it with the iron, repeat for the other side of the block, flip it over and check your seams are in the right direction. On the B block, you'll notice that all the seams are going in towards the dark fabric, and on the A block, you'll notice that all the seams are going outside towards the dark fabric. This will allow these blocks to nest together nicely if you were sewing these together into a quilt, without any sashing or borders in between them. And there we have it. You've made an A block and a B block of the 9 patch. Now I've kept my blocks nice and simple to make it easy for you to follow, a dark colour and a light colour so you can see everything that's going on, but the world is your oyster here. You can do this in multiple colours for a scrappy look, so just make sure however you're doing it with whatever colours that you always press your seams towards the darker fabric so that they will nest together when you sew them. If you wanted to make a totally scrappy look, you would need to do that without using strip units. So very similar process to what we've just done, but instead of strips you're just sewing 2 squares together at a time and then adding another square onto that and then sewing those rows together, pressing towards the darker fabric. Now let's take a look at some of the quilts that you can make using this quilt block.
With these ideas, I have used 2.5-inch strips that give me a 6.5-inch unfinished block, as in before it's attached to other quilt blocks, and then the block finishes 6 inches square once it's been attached to the columns and the rows. So let's take a look at a few ideas. So the first idea we have is a checkerboard. Now this reminds me of like a Grand Prix racing flag or something like that. And it's made of A blocks and B blocks joined together into rows and columns. And you can see that the outer corners are all A blocks, and that makes sure that everything matches. I have OCD, so I don't like when a row finishes on a B block. I prefer it to match up nicely. So to make that happen, you need to make sure that you have an odd number of rows and an odd number of columns, and that will make sure that those outer corners match. The next example we have is that checkerboard, but we've just kicked it up a bit and we've added a border to it. So the border can be any width that you like, you just need to take that into account when you're deciding how wide and how long to make your quilt. You can have more than one border as well. In this instance, I've gone for the dark blue border that matches the corners of the A blocks, because what I want is for it to feel like that border melts into those outer blue squares. It makes it feel like the pattern is floating somewhere. And this is dead easy. Once you've assembled the quilt top, you just add borders to it, joining strips where you need to, and then trimming. Our next option is a sashed 9 patch. Now this is just simply A blocks and B blocks joined together, but there is a piece of fabric in between them to separate them. Again, there is an odd number of rows and an odd number of columns, and that gives us the same blocks in the corners. You can do your sashing any width that you like. In this instance, I have gone with 2.5-inch wide sashing to match the width of the blocks in the 9 patches. I take each of the 9 patches and I attach a sashing block to the left hand side and then sew it together to form a row. And then tack one more onto the end, and that gives me a completed row. And then I take a long strip, sometimes having to join 2 strips depending on how wide my quilt is, and I then attach that to the row and then attach all the rows together. So the best thing to do would be to attach all the sashings to the side of the blocks and join them together in rows, and then put the sashing in between the rows, and that will make it easier to assemble. You can also add a border outside of the sashing to frame that a little bit more. So you could add a blue border here to really frame and make that sashing pop on the outside. Our next option we have is a sash 9 patch with cornerstone. So this is same as the block before, but all we've done is we've added little corner squares to make a kind of secondary pattern here. So you can see there's kind of crisscrossing lines that run across the quilt. Now I quite like this, and I can actually see squares on point forming with the cornerstones lining up. Again, these cornerstones are just 2.5-inch squares that are joined to the sashing strips. It's a little bit more involved to do the cornerstones, but it's not difficult, and just with a bit of careful planning, it can come together really quickly and really easily. You could also consider using a different colour from the blue. I deliberately picked the blue, as I said, to make a secondary pattern of squares on point, but you could pick a totally different colour that goes with your colour scheme to separate. And again, you can see that there are an odd number of columns and an odd number of rows, and that ensures that we have matching corners, and then each row is just made up of an A or a B block alternating. The next option we have is an additional quilt pattern, and it's called an iris chain. So this is a single iris chain, and there are other versions called double and triple iris chains. So in this instance, what we do is we take A blocks, so that's just dark cornered blocks, and we pair them with plain squares. So what you need to do here is, with the light fabric that matches the block, you measure the width and height of your 9 patch, and then you cut squares of that fabric to the same width and height, and then you join these together, alternating an A block then a plain square. Now it's still an odd number of columns and an odd number of rows here to make that pattern match. You can also add a border to the outside of this, which I haven't shown here, but if I was going to add a border, I would add a dark blue border, because that would then make the pattern feel like it was floating. You could also add a light grey as well to get the similar effect. Now if you liked these quilt ideas, these were all made using an app called Prequilt. This is a fantastic website, and what it does is it lets you design and build quilts. It has various options for the setup of the quilt, so you can have square grids, you can have diamonds, you can have things on point, and then you build and construct blocks using their fabric library, which has most of the major designers in there, or you can upload swatches of your own fabric. You can use this addition quilt patterns. It has tons of great features that can randomly rotate and come up with quilt patterns for you. It's a really fantastic tool. It's very affordable. There's a free plan to get you started so you can try it out, and then they have 2 paid plans that are, as I said, very affordable. I highly recommend this tool. I used to design all my quilt blocks in Photoshop, which is a photo editing app. It was really complicated and really time consuming and took a long time, whereas this makes it so easy and so simple and so fast. You can reuse blocks that you've already designed by creating a block library, and then you have a stash of all your fabrics, and you have color palettes. It's fantastic. I highly recommend you check it out. The website's prequilt.com.
So well done. This was the second video in our Behind the Block series, and you've managed it successfully. I really hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. If you had any questions about this, why not leave me a comment down below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. If you have an idea for a block that you'd love to see me cover in this Behind the Block series, again, leave me a comment below. Make sure you like this video by giving it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button and click the little bell so you get notified when I release my next video. In the next Behind the Blocks video, we are going to be looking at the disappearing 9 patch, which is a variation that can be made from this 9 patch that you've just made. I just hope I can find it in time for the video, because it seems to have disappeared. So until then, take care.